Now it's my great privilege to invite Honorable Helen Rosenthal, New York City Council Member, District 6 of Manhattan, and the Chair on the Committee on Women.
Thank you so much. Wow, if I were still in academia, I'd have a slideshow. But it turns out I'm a member of the City Council, which means that I have no time to put together a slideshow. So, with apologies, I really want to thank Soroush Roshan and the Fordham Graduate School of Social Service Institute for Women and Girls for inviting me to speak today. As I listened to the presenters, I realized that I'm in a room full of partners. And as I'll say again at the end of my talk, I need your help. So I've left out my card and some information about work that I'm doing, but I'm begging you, please, take my card, take my information, and reach out to me, because what I don't want to do is be creating solutions in a vacuum. I became chair of the Committee on Women this January when I became when I started my second term as council member for the Upper West Side. And it's an understatement to say I could not have taken on the work of this committee at a more meaningful time for women. When I became chair, the Me Too movement was rocketing through our society. Women and girls across the country and a growing number of men were coming forward with harrowing stories of sexual harassment, abuse, and violence at work, in school, on sports teams, in religious institutions, in the military, and probably every other context. Let's be clear, over the last several years, we have seen a growing number of courageous sexual abuse survivors stepping forward, but that stream has now become a raging river. What has become very clear to us over the last year, whether the Committee on Women has been tackling workplace sexual harassment and abuse, the lack of adequate police department resources for sexual assault survivors, assault and abuse in our jails, or the persistence of domestic violence across our communities, is that we have to listen to survivors. Abuse of power, as you say, is always involved. And to craft the best solutions, legislative bodies like the City Council must fully reflect the diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, race, religion, and lived experiences of our society. I say that today because I'm hoping someone here will run for City Council in the very near future. Right now, only 11 of the 51 of us are women. 11, less than 20%. It means that there are 6 committees in the City Council that have no women on them. My first act as chair was to investigate our own backyard here in New York City. I called a joint hearing with the Committee on Civil and Human Rights, seeking to understand the full scope of sexual harassment within the City of New York's municipal workforce, how incidents of harassment are currently being reported. With over 330,000 employees, city government is the largest employer here in New York City. The response, silence, was dispiriting. At the hearing, we examined existing sexual harassment policies within city agencies and departments and explored best practices that prevent workplace abuse. Again, the silence was deafening. And so the City Council's Stop Sexual Harassment in New York City Act was signed into law by de Blasio this May, which has some of the most far-reaching anti-harassment protections in the United States. They're listed here in the handout. The Act expands protections to every single New York City worker, even a domestic worker, regardless of where they work and how small the company. Every workplace, whether a private company or city agency, is now required to post sexual harassment policy for everyone to see. Private businesses with 15 or more employees have to provide regular training on what constitutes sexual harassment and what to do, what you are required to do if you see it or experience it. City agencies and departments are required annually to provide robust anti-harassment trainings and report on the number of complaints filed, how many were unfounded, and how many were substantiated and action was taken. That's something new. And there have to be surveys, anonymous surveys, that allow employees to respond to how they feel the climate is in terms of sexual harassment in their workplace. I'm very proud that we passed the Stop Sexual Harassment in New York City Act this year, but I have no illusion of the kind of long-term systemic social change that is needed if we are ever going to see an end to workplace harassment. And as everyone in the room knows, the very sobering truth is that workplace harassment is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to gender-based abuse. The continuum stretches from seemingly innocuous, like catcalls on the street, to the horrific extremes of sexual assault and rape. The issue of sexual assault has taken stage nationally, and I strongly believe that we must capture this moment. Assault survivors must be fully heard, although they have not been. They must be fully believed, although they have not been. And their assault must be properly investigated, although in New York City it is not. Our experience so far is illustrative of the changes involved in making sexual assault and violence a priority for our society. In March of this year, the city's Department of Investigation released a disturbing report which found that New York City's police department routinely understaffs its division which investigates most sex crimes, the Special Victims Division. How many of you have watched SVU on TV? Yes. Right? Yeah. The city's SVD looks nothing like that. Last year, the SVD reported it had just 67 detectives overseeing 5,661 assault cases. Think about that for a moment. That's over 80 cases for each detective. The level of staffing is far below the national standards. And according to one widely used model, the SVD would have required effectively double the number they have had to devote adequate time to each case. The Department of Investigation report also found that the NYPD was interviewing and processing sexual assault victims in locations that were unfit. The distance between the victims and their perpetrators was zero. There was no space, there is no space to conduct private interviews. The tracking of sexual assault cases is with outdated and vulnerable case management software, and indeed we've seen leaks to the press which have resulted in unreparable harm. Although the police commissioner will make an apology tomorrow, public apology, for the irreparable harm done to the woman who was raped in Prospect Park back in 1994. It's 2018. The SVD currently prioritizes stranger rape and high-profile cases over acquaintance rape. Acquaintance rape, seemingly an unimportant rape. And let's just keep this in perspective, right? Every year, there are between 5 to 8 serial rapists in New York City who are out there, who may or may not be caught, right? Every 20 years, there is a serial killer. Which department do you think has the most sophisticated, well-trained, highest grade level detectives? Homicide. So the report confirmed what we all suspected, that underreporting of sexual assault in New York City is a crisis. And I called a joint hearing this spring with our Public Safety Committee to investigate further. And the key lesson we learned is that unless we address the underlying causes of underreporting, investigators will continue to be overworked and undertrained. Facilities for victims will remain unwelcoming and substandard. Investigators' case management system won't be able to guarantee victims' privacy or the integrity of information collected. And the end result, victims coming to the police may likely experience re-traumatization. I should say it differently. They do experience re-traumatization. I'm actually going to skip over the work that we've done over the last few months in order to give the NYPD the opportunity, and our mayor the opportunity, to stand up and say, we want to have a cutting-edge SVD. We want it to be the SVU you see on TV. That's the opportunity that this DOI report gifted this mayor and this commissioner at a time when all we're talking about, really, is how women are not heard or believed. However, this week we'll be passing legislation to require the New York Police Department, to implement some changes. We are going to require the Special Victims Division to get the training, the survivor-centric training that has to happen for detectives to be able to investigate a case without doing what they do now, which is start with, what were you wearing? How many drinks did you have? Do you have a boyfriend who maybe you want to cheat on? It's no surprise that only 5 to 25% of those who are raped come forward. We have to change that. Very similarly, we're pushing the city to far more aggressively address sexual abuse and harassment within our jails. Allegations of sex abuse and harassment in city jails jumped 40% from 2016 to 2017. Again, allegations, by that I mean reporting. Of the over 1,100 complaints filed by inmates last year, 1 has been substantiated. 97% are still under investigation. And while women make up just 6% of New York's incarcerated population, of course, 22% of the abuse allegations in the last year came from the Rikers Island Rosemary Singer Center, which houses the women. And trans and gender nonconforming individuals are victimized by sexual violence in local jails at shockingly disproportionate rates. And although the Department of Corrections has set up a new housing unit in the women's jail center for these individuals, the officers refuse to put anyone there who is not biologically of the gender that would house them there. It's hard to imagine a more traumatic location for sexual violence than a jail. Whether you're being assaulted by prison personnel or a fellow inmate, victims are especially powerless, and making an official complaint comes with real risk. It begs to reason that the 1,100 complaints filed last year represent an even worse reality. And it's especially discouraging that the vast majority of last year's assault complaints remain pending, which further discourages other victims from coming forward. What do they have to gain? My colleagues and I held a joint committee hearing last month to investigate further, and we're developing legislation that will push the Department of Correction to take sexual assault more seriously. This includes both improved safety practices in order to prevent sexual abuse and more effective responses when a complaint is made. And just this week, the Committee on Women held a lengthy hearing on perhaps the most insidious form of gender-informed abuse in our society, as we just heard about here, domestic violence. DV crosses the lines of class, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, but women are historically the most impacted. In 2017, the NYPD responded to almost 300 intimate partner-related domestic incident reports every day. 300 every day. Murders in New York City have declined significantly, as we've all heard about in the paper. But one category has remained stubbornly high and in fact hasn't changed over the last 25 years, and that's domestic violence homicides. And now, where it used to be 5%, now 17% of all homicides are DV fatalities. In 2017, there were 26 intimate partner homicides across New York City, over 50 if you include the other family members. These crime trends raise exactly the same question that we're confronting with the NYPD's approach to sexual assault. Does the level of resources that we're allocating reflect a real and serious commitment to addressing the issue? And again, we are working on 4 pieces of legislation designed to ensure that the city is delivering resources and services to domestic violence survivors in the most appropriate, strategic, and effective way. I'd like to close with 2 thoughts. First, by saying something about the name of my committee. It can be argued that workplace sexual assault, police resources for sexual assault survivors, assault and abuse in our jails, and domestic violence are all essentially women's issues. But what these issues all have in common, to your point, Ambassador, extends far beyond gender. They are abuses of power. We see clearly that the LGBTQ community, gender non-conforming individuals, and men can all be victimized in these situations. Addressing abuses of power requires demanding full transparency, listening to survivors, prioritizing resources to the most vulnerable. And legislative bodies like the City Council must fully reflect the diversity of the lived experiences of our society. And so, I repeat, I'm looking for partners in this room. Secondly, we need to listen and partner with the academics who have studied these issues and know the importance for our policymakers. I need you to get out of your silos which someone mentioned earlier, and help me use my platform to ensure better outcomes for those who are the most vulnerable among us. The elderly, older adults, people with disabilities, people of color, and women. I want to move beyond inserting the proper language into our laws to doing something that will get us results. Let me tell you what I'm thinking about right now. New York City has turned over to everyone who lives here the opportunity to talk about changing our charter. There's a 2019 Charter Revision Commission, 2019, where every aspect of the charter is open to revision. One of the things I'd like to see is the adoption of the CEDAW principles. But here's the problem. San Francisco did that about 10 years ago, a long time back. And what they adopted was reporting requirements, that the city report out on indicators of gender non-parity. And everyone celebrates that. But if you go online, over the past few years, not even the reports have been issued. So we don't even know anymore. So what I'm looking for is partners who will help us figure out how to change the city's charter in a meaningful way to adjust the issues of the difference in power between men and women and the result of that. I'm looking for partners, and I'm thanking you for your time.